Shiny Pokemon, the most elusive and ultimate rarity a Pokemon can have. Originally released in Generation 2, Shiny Pokemon were a really cool way to show off the capabilities of the new Game Boy Color's advanced color palette. But this video isn't about the history of Shiny Pokemon. Instead, I want to highlight the cool shiny hunting methods of each generation, starting with Generation 1. Now look, I know what most of you are thinking, how can you find shinies when they weren't even introduced until Generation 2? And you're right. There isn't any way to find a shiny Pokemon in Generation 1, but that doesn't mean that the Pokemon won't be shiny when you transfer to Generation 2. You see, the way Generation 2 calculated whether a Pokemon was shiny or not was based on the Pokemon's IVs. This means that if you managed to catch a Pokemon with the exact IVs needed for it to be shiny, then when you transferred it over to Gold, Silver, or Crystal, you would have a shiny. Now, there was no way to see your Pokemon's IVs without using glitches or cheating, but what you could do is calculate the stats your Pokemon would have if it did roll those IVs. And in case you want to try this for yourself, I recommend checking out this Generation 1 shiny tool from Blue Moon Falls. I have no affiliation with them, but it's an easy resource to see what stats you would need to have in order for your Pokemon to be shiny when you transfer it over. Granted, the odds are still incredibly rare as it's still your regular 1 in 8192 odds, but the possibility is there nevertheless, and it could make for a really cool shiny hunt. Now, Generation 2 has a lot more ways to obtain shinies since it was the generation that introduced them. Shinies were incredibly rare though. The odds of getting one were 1 in 8192, so unless you hunted for them, it was really rare for the average player to just randomly run into one. But this generation did introduce a few ways to encounter them. For starters, you get your freebie shiny Gyarados at the Lake of Rage. I wouldn't necessarily call this a shiny hunt since it's a guaranteed shiny. So what do I consider a hunt? Well, in my eyes, it's any method of trying to get a shiny Pokemon that doesn't guarantee one. So let's break down the possible ways to do this in Generation 2. To start off, you have your soft resets, your bread and butter. This method is simple and is used for static encounters. Think of your starter, a legendary, or a random Sudowoodo that's blocking your path. The setup for this method of hunting is pretty simple. You just walk up to whatever encounter, save the game, and check for a shiny. If your Pokemon is not shiny, you do a soft reset, which essentially restarts the game and brings you back to the title screen. And that's it. You rinse and repeat until you have your shiny. The second method is runaways. You know how relentless those Sentret were at the start of the game? Well, we're gonna keep running into them until eventually one of them shines. You can even incorporate a repel if you are hunting for a specific Pokemon that you know appears at a higher level than everything else in the area. Simply use your repel and have the leading Pokemon in your party be the level of the target that you're aiming for. And lastly, you have your egg hunts, which you have to have some next level patience for these because you won't know if a Pokemon is shiny until it hatches. But that's not entirely true. You see, due to the way shiny Pokemon are generated in Generation 2, you can do some things to increase your odds of getting a shiny from 1 in 8192 all the way down to 1 in 64. You remember how I mentioned that a Pokemon shininess is determined based on their IVs? Well, it turns out that if you have a male shiny Pokemon and you put it in the daycare, there is a high chance that those same IVs from that parent will be passed down to the baby Pokemon. And well, it essentially passes down its shininess, meaning that any breedable Pokemon can have those odds. And even if you don't have a male shiny Pokemon, you remember the old man that gave you that odd egg? Well, it turns out that that egg has boosted shiny odds to about 14%. If you want to do this hunt, just make sure you save the game before you pick up the egg, otherwise you'll be stuck on the same egg and the shininess won't really change. Next, we have Generation 3. This generation holds a special place in my heart since it was the first gen to get me into Pokemon, and I even found a shiny here while playing Fire Red. I remember I was training one of my brother's Pokemon in his save file when I found a shiny Fearow. Now, his Game Boy had a bad screen which distorted the colors on the right side. That plus the fact that Fearow shiny isn't too different made it very hard to convince my brother to catch this thing, but he did, only for me to convince him to delete the save file because I kind of want to replay the story. Yeah, I'm kind of a bad brother. Generation 3 changed the way that Pokemon were generated. Pokemon's shiny status were no longer determined based on their IVs, but instead it was based on your secret ID and trainer ID. It also introduced natures, abilities, and multiple other changes. This is why you couldn't really transfer Pokemon from Generation 1 and Generation 2 over to Generation 3. And for shiny hunters, this meant that the boosted egg method was no longer a thing. But Generation 3 doesn't really have any super interesting methods to shiny hunt Pokemon. You have your basic soft resets, runaway, and egg hunts, and for the sake of not sounding like a broken record, these will be available in every game moving forward, so I'm not going to be mentioning them from here on out. Despite Gen 3 not having any specific methods to increase your odds of getting a shiny, there are some cool ways to increase your encounter speed to make shiny hunting Pokemon much faster. And how exactly do you do this? Well, with gambling. The Game Corner. You see, if you max out your coin case, you can buy one of these Pokemon from Fire Red and Leaf Green's Game Corner in exchange for coins. This is actually the hunt I'm currently doing in my Fire Red Shiny Badge quest. You can get through 55 Abras in about 15 minutes, meaning that if you spend about 1 hour, you can see 220 Abras. So this is probably one of the quickest hunts you can do in Generation 3. Let's talk about the hole-in games real quick. because there is a shiny hunting method you can use here as well, although a lot of the people in the shiny hunting community, including myself, see it as cheating. I'm talking about RNG manipulation. This has to do with the way Generation 3 generates Pokemon. You see, when you start up your save file, the game lands on a random seed, and then when you encounter a Pokemon, it's also a randomized number within that seed. So a seed is pretty much a database, and when you encounter a Pokemon, the Pokemon that's generated is based on that data within that database. To explain it in simple terms, imagine your Pokemon game is a warehouse, and inside of that warehouse there are hundreds of ball pits. The ball pits represent the seeds. When you load into a save file, it's like jumping into a random ball pit within that warehouse. Now when you encounter a Pokemon, it's like picking up a random ball inside of that ball pit. This makes it so that it is almost impossible to load into the same pit and grab the same ball. With RNG manipulation, however, it would be like jumping into the same pit, and using softwares you would be able to see what balls are inside of that pit and manipulate the data so that you know what ball you're picking, aka the shiny Pokemon. Generation 3 is a lot easier to RNG manipulate due to the way that the number generation works. This is because when the clock battery dries out, Ruby and Sapphire are locked to their seed, essentially making the RNG not so random anymore. This is also the case with Emerald, except that this one is broken regardless of the battery status. No matter what you do, it will always load the same seed. Don't get me wrong, you can still shiny hunt in these games, but be mindful, if you do soft resets, it's highly likely you'll be encountering the same Pokemon since you will be resetting with the same frames and the same seeds. Luckily, Emerald was so kind that almost every legendary can be hunted as a runaway encounter, which is a super cool detail because it allows you to actually shiny hunt these legendaries without the need to actually do soft resets. Now, I'm no expert when it comes to RNG manipulation. There are a lot of really cool creators that have in-depth guides or even have made some really cool projects, all thanks to glitches and RNG manipulation. I'm a Blissey is a really good example that comes to mind, so if you're interested in this, I highly recommend checking that channel out. Generation 4. Nostalgia hits so hard with this one. Generation 4 was the first generation that officially adopted the term shiny to describe these rare Pokemon. Generation 4 also gave us two new methods for shiny hunting Pokemon, the Masuda method and the Pokeradar. By breeding two Pokemon from different regions of the world, you can cut your shiny odds from the 1 in 8192 all the way down to 1 in 1638, essentially making it over 4 times more likely for a Pokemon to shine. This shiny hunting method was kept under the rug until the Game Freak director Junichi Masuda made a blog post saying that breeding two Pokemon from different regions of the world would lead to higher shiny odds. From there, the community dubbed this the Masuda method, and it has remained in every mainline Pokemon game since then. The second method is Pokeradar. In Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum post-game, once you unlock the national decks, Professor Rowan will also give you the Pokeradar. Now, I'm not gonna lie, these were so hard to use. I remember watching so many guys on YouTube on how to use the Pokeradar to get a shiny, but I could never get a chain high enough to encounter one. When using the Pokeradar, you would see patches of grass shake, and your goal was to step into one of those patches and defeat the Pokemon. Patches of grass would then shake again, and your goal was to find the same Pokemon and defeat it again, creating a chain. If you didn't see a patch that you liked, you could also run 50 steps and retry the radar to see if you get better patches. If you encountered the same Pokemon, it would be added onto your chain. The chain would start with full odds and progress until you reach a chain of 40, in which Pokemon receive max odds of 1 in 200. From here, it was all about refreshing the radar until you will see one with a sparkle. This sounds so much easier on paper, but there are so many hidden rules when it comes to using the Pokeradar to make sure that you don't break your chain. I have never been able to get a shiny with this method, but if you have, please let me know in the comments and let me know how your experience was. I'd love to hear about it. Now, some other things that you can do to increase your odds is taking advantage of double battles. When you first enter Eternal Forest, you meet Cheryl and you help guide her to the exit. This is a pretty cool moment for shiny hunting because it allows you to double your encounter rate. This can also be done in Iron Island when you pair up with Riley, although it's highly risky since the Gravelers in this area don't really like to stick around, if you know what I mean. Similarly to Gen 3, Gen 4 also has some glitches that could affect shiny odds, more specifically the Q-Charm glitch. You see, if you get a Pokemon with the Q-Charm ability and have a specific trainer ID and secret ID combination, it will actually cause a glitch to happen in which every Pokemon of the opposite gender will have boosted odds of being shiny. Now, the odds of this happening in a normal save file are incredibly rare, but through some RNG manipulation, you can make this happen in your own game. Heart Gold and Soul Silver brought back the Game Corner, which could be used similarly to Fire Red and Leaf Green to get some quick encounters. These games didn't have the Pokeradar, but what they did have is possibly one of the coolest hunts in all of Pokemon. I'm talking about the shiny starter soft reset. Normally, you can't see if your starter is shiny until you pick it and either send it to battle or check its summary, but in these games you can actually see its shiny sprite without the need to select your starter. This means that you can check all 3 starters at once and increase your encounters super quick. Moving on to Generation 5, there weren't any new methods introduced in this generation, but we did see an introduction of an item that would change shiny hunting moving forward. I'm talking about the Shiny Charm. Introduced in Black and White 2, the Shiny Charm triples your odds, making every encounter have 1 in 2731 odds. Gen 5 also saw an improvement to the Masuda method odds with a slight increase from 1 in 1638 to 1 in 365. Now, if you pair this with the Shiny Charm, you'd get odds of 1 in 1024. Generation 5 also introduced a new type of darker grass which had higher odds of costing a double battle, and Generation 5 was also the one that introduced something that we shiny hunters really disliked, and that was the shiny lock, essentially making it so that you can't hunt Reshiram and Zekrom. And that about covers all the changes to shiny hunting in Generation 5. Now Generation 6, this generation was to shiny hunting what the Industrial Revolution was to America. Generation 6 introduced so many new fun new methods to shiny hunt. This is also the generation where I severely obsessed over shinies. I'm not kidding. I remember I would sometimes tell my friends I had homework to do just to try to get more shinies at home. It was bad. Let's start with the easiest way to get shinies, and that is chain fishing. To do this method, all you had to do was fish. You didn't even have to KO the Pokemon. So long as you kept reeling them in without missing a bite, you'd keep the chain going and increase your odds. I couldn't find any reliable statistic, but most of them seem to have the odds around 1 in 100 after a chain of 20. This was the method that got me hooked on shiny hunting. I remember catching every available fishing Pokemon since this method was pretty easy. Generation 6 also introduced horde encounters, which let you battle 5 wild Pokemon at once. And if you've been following along with the video already, then you already know the more encounters the better. Generation 6 also doubled the shiny odds, making every encounter a 1 in 4096 chance. This improvement also translated to the shiny charm, which has 1 in 1365 odds, which is crazy because that is the Masuda method odds of black and white too. Speaking of the Masuda method, base odds with no shiny charm jumped to 1 in 682 and 1 in 512 with the shiny charm. But by far the easiest method to get shinies was horde encounters. Like, they were literally so busted though. It wasn't impossible to see players getting multiple shinies through horde encounters because of how good the odds were. X and Y also introduced the friend safari, which allowed you to visit a pen with 3 wild Pokemon of a specific type. It used the friend list you had in your 3DS and assigned everyone a random typing. This was one of my favorite additions because it had crazy good odds, 1 in 585 to be exact. Pokemon here were also guaranteed to have 2 perfect IVs. I even remember spamming my friend code in comment sections of YouTube videos, hoping to add more people so I can have more pens to hunt in. X and Y also saw the return of the Pokeradar. It was still really hard to use in my opinion, but it was nowhere near as difficult as Gen 4. I actually got a few shinies in X and Y through this method. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire switched things up a bit. We still had horde encounters, but we lost the friend safari and the Pokeradar. But instead, it was replaced with the Dex Nav. I absolutely love the Dex Nav. I kid you not, I've probably gotten over 60 shinies from just this method alone. Similar to the Pokeradar, you would start a chain by searching for a Pokemon, encountering it, and then defeating it. There wasn't an end goal of a chain of 40 like the Pokeradar. Instead, the odds would be calculated based on the search level of the Pokemon and the number on your chain. The shiny charm would also affect these odds, but I couldn't really find anything reliable that said what exactly the odds were. Now, I don't know if it's just nostalgia hitting, but Generation 6 really was la creme de la creme when it came to shiny hunting. You could encounter pretty much every legendary in ORAS, and you had a ton of different methods to hunt in both games. And then we have Generation 7. Generation 7 removed the methods that were introduced in Generation 6 and replaced them with 2 new methods, SOS encounters and the Pokepelago. The SOS method is replacement of the Dexnav method. It was a lot slower compared to Pokéradar and the Dexnav, but I really like how natural it seemed. It definitely fit the aesthetic of Alola. To set up for this method, you would just encounter a wild Pokemon, weaken it a little bit, and from there, just stall until it calls for help. Then you would defeat that called in Pokemon and rinse and repeat until you found a shiny. The reason I'm not a big fan of this method is because the wild Pokemon aren't guaranteed to call for help, so sometimes you would just go through a few turns just stalling the battle, not adding any encounters to your chain. The odds for a shiny with this method were about 1 in 315 and 1 in 273 with the shiny charm. The odds were quite good, but in my opinion, this method wasn't as good as the options we had in Generation 6. Sun and Moon also introduced the Pokepelago, which allowed you to visit this island. You would place some beans in a basket and it would draw in wild Pokemon. The odds for a shiny with this method aren't really clear online, but every source seems to have it higher than the base 1 in 4096 odds. I've never personally hunted with this method, so I can't speak on it from experience, but if you have, please let me know in the comments what you think of this method and what the odds you think are. Pokemon Ultra Sun and Moon introduced a new mechanic called the Ultra Warp Ride. By traveling through these wormholes, you could encounter powerful Pokemon or visit places where you could encounter legendary Pokemon. The farther you would travel, the higher the odds you would have of encountering a shiny Pokemon as well. The odds of this method weren't clear, but what I can tell you from personal experience is that shinies with this method were incredibly easy. I remember setting up for shiny hunts to do on legendaries and accidentally ending the wormhole run on an encounter and finding a shiny Pokemon. So if you're looking to get into shiny hunting and want to try something that doesn't require a lot of commitment or patience, I'd recommend starting with this method. Moving on to the Nintendo Switch games, starting off with Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. These games are super cool because you didn't need to run around the grass to see if a Pokemon was shiny. Pokemon would just appear in the overworld. The game still had its base 1 in 4096 odds, but because of this, we were able to see many Pokemon in such a short amount of time. It almost felt like the odds were higher just because of this change. Additionally, you could also chain Pokemon and boost your odds. All you had to do was start a catch combo on a Pokemon and it would boost your odds in general. This means that you could chain together 31 Weedles and be running around until you found the shiny that you wanted. You didn't need to catch the shiny of the catch combo Pokemon. Oh yeah, and this method brought the odds down to 1 in 315. This is the same odds as the SOS method from Sun and Moon, but you're actually seeing a ton more Pokemon. I actually played this game for the first time with a full shiny team because of just how easy it was to hunt for them. Sword and Shield didn't introduce any new methods, but it did introduce a KO counter mechanic, which could increase the rolls a wild Pokemon would get to be a shiny. If you get this number to 500, it brings your odds to about 1 in 455. Additionally, you could also get the shiny charm to increase base odds. The Sword and Shield DLC also introduced the Dynamax Adventure, which would have you and a team of people battling powerful Pokemon together. This method had increased odds of 1 in 300 without the shiny charm and 1 in 100 with it. The odds for this method are really good, but you do have to remember that to complete the Dynamax Adventure, you would need to play for around 20 minutes. And then we had the Messy Diamond and Pearl remakes. These games had all of the methods from the original Gen 4 games, but with updated odds. They also introduced the Grand Underground Grottos, which had rarer Pokemon, but it was still the base odds. Legends Arceus, however, had mass outbreaks, which drastically increased the shiny odds. The odds with mass outbreaks were around 1 in 158, making this one of the best methods in the series. This game also had other mechanics like Research Level, which if it was maxed out would cut your base odds in half and increase odds with the mass outbreaks as well. Then you had your shiny charm, which you could also stack on top of all of these methods. Scarlet and Violet switched things up a bit by introducing the sandwich method. With this method, you could create a picnic, and based on the sandwich recipe you use, you could actually boost your shiny odds to 1 in 512. This game also carried over the outbreak mechanic from Legends Arceus and the KO counter from Sword and Shield, except that this time you would only need to chain together 60 KOs for max odds instead of 500. And that is it for the Switch lineup so far. Pokemon Legends ZA still hasn't dropped, but we can assume it'll have the shiny charm and all of the mainline methods, but we still have to see if a new method is introduced. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. Also, if you guys want to comment down below what your favorite generation of shiny hunt Pokemon is and what your preferred method is, I'd love to hear about it. Until next time.